A very good morning to you. We are beginning the programme with the war in Iran, and in an astonishing development, Donald Trump says the US Navy will blockade the Strait of Hormuz from later today. So that's the US president threatening to use the American military to intercept and stop vessels Iran has allowed to pass through the strait. President Trump says the blockade will begin from 10 a.m. Eastern Time. That's 3 p.m. UK time.
So Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that, in his words, any Iranian who fires at us or at peaceful vessels will be, in capital letters, blown to hell. Well, peace talks between the US and Iran collapsed at the weekend, with America blaming Iran for refusing to abandon its nuclear weapons programme.
We should say there's currently a fragile ceasefire still in place between Iran and the US, although Israel continues to strike Lebanon. But Trump's threat risks widening the war and pushing up oil prices, which are back above $100 a barrel this morning, and potentially causing more economic pain across the world. Here is President Trump speaking late last night.
Iran's in very bad shape. And just so you understand, Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. Will not have. There is no way that they're going to get. They still want it. And they made that clear the other night. Iran will not have a nuclear weapon.
How long are you waiting for them to come back before getting things going?
Oh, I don't know. I don't care if they come back or not. If they don't come back, I'm fine.
Well, Sally Lockwood is in Dubai for us. Sally, can you just explain to us, how is this blockade actually going to work?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's been a bit of confusion, if not bemusement, in this region that Donald Trump has announced this blockade on a waterway that's already been blockaded by the Iranians during the course of this war. But what Donald Trump, it seems, is trying to do here is to stop Iranian tankers and Iranian vessels leaving Iran's ports and passing the Strait of Hormuz, because Iran has continued to export just as much oil throughout the course of this war as it did prior to the war, and they're charging much higher prices for it. So they're doing well financially out of this war. At the moment, Donald Trump wants to put a stop to that. He also wants to essentially blockade any other vessels who are paying Iran these de facto tolls which have come into place since the start of the war as well, and to prohibit them from passing too. And it seems, according to US defense officials, that the plan is that this would buy America and the American military some time to sweep the Strait of Hormuz for mines, which are causing so much risk to vessels trying to pass, and to create some sort of protected channel within the Strait of Hormuz that could then potentially be opened for commercial shipping to resume again. And we've seen some movement in terms of the US military in the last 48 hours. 2 US Navy destroyers passed the Strait of Hormuz on Saturday, seemingly in preparation for this mine-sweeping effort. There's a huge US Navy build-up around the Strait of Hormuz, as well as that aircraft carrier, that USS Abraham Lincoln, which is in the Arabian Sea, which is thought could perhaps be a base for these operations. The big question is, how is Iran going to view this, and how could it potentially react? Iran has a huge geographical advantage because they control the entire northern coastline of the Strait of Hormuz. Any ships and naval vessels in the Strait of Hormuz could be vulnerable not just to mines but also to drone attacks. And they also have, despite the Iranian Navy being hammered in the course of this war, they still have a large number of very small speedboats, which are used by the Revolutionary Guard as attack boats to attack vessels trying to pass that don't have their approval. So it's going to be really interesting to see how all of this transpires, and if indeed Iran does try to prohibit this effort by the US Navy, will that break the ceasefire? There are a lot of questions, and of course we have a little over a week left of this ceasefire. There is still time for another round of talks, but there is also the potential that this war could get a whole lot worse. Let's see. We've got a few hours now until that deadline for when Donald Trump is going to blockade the Strait of Hormuz at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, which is 6 p.m. local here, 3 p.m. if you're in the UK. So we may get a clearer idea of how things are going and how things are looking after that.
Sally, great stuff as always. Thanks so much. So how are markets responding to that threat from President Trump to blockade the Straits of Hormuz himself? Well, unsurprisingly, oil prices are higher when you now have both sides willing to restrict the flow of oil and other commodities out of the region. Higher by the tune of 6.5% to 101.5, so a very big single-day move, 6.5%, and back above $100 a barrel once again, and clearly still a lot higher from where we started the war. Perhaps worth just dwelling on where we got down to last week, or only down to last week, because last week when we heard that there was a ceasefire in place, that there would be peace talks over the weekend in person in Islamabad, perhaps you could frame that as the single most optimistic moment of the conflict so far, and yet the oil price only got down to 95. Yeah, it's down from the peak of 117 a few weeks ago, but just worth pointing out how high it is relative to where we started the year. Back at the start of January, before the war, of course, began, we were about 60. So whether or not you're on a good news day or a bad news day in the war, you're still talking about higher to the tune of 45% or 50% or 60%. And it is worth just noting, therefore, that whatever's happened over the last couple of weeks, we're talking about much higher inflation prints here in the UK for the rest of the year. When we talk about inflation each month, the data that we get monthly, we're talking about year-over-year inflation. So we've got another 8-9 months or so of monthly data where the biggest input in terms of commodities, oil, is going to be up 40, 50, 60% either way, regardless of if it's a good news, bad news day in this particular war. What does that mean for UK borrowing costs? It means they're elevated and they're sticky higher. Good news moves down a bit, bad news moves back up again. We're about 4.25% this morning, off the peak of 4.5, but vastly higher from 3.5%. This is the one-year borrowing cost. A reminder, the Bank of England base rate is 3.75%. So before the war, we're expecting a cut. We now expect a hike or two during the course of this year. And again, small fluctuations in the grand scheme of things, whether it's good news or bad news over the course of the last week. Just want to end by showing what the US tech-heavy NASDAQ stock index has done during the course of the war. For context, this was April last year, Liberation Day, when President Trump announced those tariffs. The market responded to that terribly in the US. We saw a two-day move of 11%. Huge for two particular days, and a peak to trough move of 17%. And that was enough to pressure President Trump to U-turn, to step back from the brink, and markets have rallied since. Well, even at the trough last week during this particular war, before news of ceasefire talks, the pre-war to mid-trough of the war move in the US stock market was only down 5.5%. And in fact, by the end of last week, on hopes for those ceasefire talks, it was back to essentially flat. In fact, up 1% from before the war started. And that might be a reason why, once again, President Trump over the weekend decides to put his foot down again, to escalate things with this talk of a blockade. Because even though the polls are turning against him, even though there is, of course, pressure at the pump in the US, the broad US stock market hasn't really done much, certainly not as much as it did last April. And by the way, last April was quite an easy off-ramp for him. He just lowered the tariffs again. As we've learned over the last 6 weeks, the off-ramp for this particular crisis is incredibly complicated, much harder to put the genie back in the bottle. And this chart, at least, compared to those other two, seems to show a bit of complacency, whereas clearly oil prices remain very elevated over the course of the last week, whether it's a good news day or a bad one.
Well, Sky News understands that the UK will not be involved in the blockade, and Donald Trump is not happy about it. He once again compared the Prime Minister to Neville Chamberlain, when we can discuss this a little bit further with Alex, who joins us now. So Donald Trump not happy, but it doesn't sound like the UK's budging.
Absolutely not budging. Yeah, I think the government's been consistent that this isn't our war. We're not going to get involved in it. The response is all about we support freedom of navigation. We don't want ships to be charged tolls, and also the emphasis on working with international partners. But there's no doubt this is really bad for us, because the more that the strait remains closed, that's really bad for oil prices. It's bad for the cost of living here. But despite that, ministers are still reluctant to criticise Donald Trump. We had Olivia Bailey, the education minister, on earlier. I think we could take a listen to what she had to say.
We are not going to be taking part in it, and we want to see free navigation of the Straits of Hormuz.
So does that mean you don't agree with the blockade?
It means that we won't be taking part in the blockade, and we want to see free navigation of the Straits of Hormuz.
Oh, I'm struggling here. I don't understand if you agree with it or not.
I hope I'm being clear that we will not be taking part in it. We think freedom of the Straits of Hormuz is really important. We don't want to see anything that isn't free navigation of the Straits of Hormuz, and we are working with our international allies to secure that.
I had some sympathy for her specifically, because she's clearly not qualified or senior enough, no offence in that sense, to be speaking for the government here, and has been given what she can and can't say to come out and address, but it just sounds ridiculous, I think, when you don't...
It's such a straightforward question. Do you agree with this in principle or not? And instead it's just... she's completely echoing the government statement there, or this is what we're going to try and do to mitigate the worst effects, or this is what we're doing. But the key question is, do you agree in principle?
Yeah. But with an expanded answer, you can hedge your bets. You can not be too critical. Presumably the aim here is to be not too critical of President Trump. But if you say a few more words, a few more sentences, you can actually hedge your position a little bit, and it's just sort of quite counterproductive sometimes.
It's frustrating, I think, when it's difficult to get, like you say, like a straight answer to the question as well. The other thing that we did try and speak to her about as well is this story, which, again, I'm still not completely clear on after the interview, if I'm being completely honest, about whether or not it is right that these reports are saying the UK government is preparing to introduce legislation to align to the single markets without a vote. What are you picking up, Alex?
Well, she was very clear, Olivia Bailey, that there would be a full debate and a full vote. So she seems to be sort of dismissing those reports. But the report suggests that secondary legislation, which is sort of carries less parliamentary scrutiny, could be used to amend a new bill on food and drink. This is my understanding of it. And so sort of wave changes through without maybe getting the full parliamentary scrutiny. But she did seem to sort of dampen that down. But I think what's interesting is how the EU is sort of tied into this conversation that we're having about Iran, that Keir Starmer was saying last week, that he thinks closer ties to the EU should almost be our response to this war, that it could be a solution to the problems that we're having with NATO and defensively. So kind of interesting that maybe going back to the past is kind of our answer to the future.
Thanks, Alex. Well, pleased to say that next on the programme is the leader of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch. Great to have you here with us today. So much to discuss, as always. I did just want to start with Iran, if I may, because Donald Trump has said the US is going to blockade the Strait of Hormuz starting at 3 p.m. UK time. Is that something the UK should be getting involved in?
Well, what I've said is if you break it, you own it. What's unclear to us is what his strategy is. And I don't think that if the strategy is unclear, we should be getting involved. What I want Keir Starmer to do is focus on the national interest, deal with things that he can handle domestically. If there's a problem with oil supplies, let's drill our own oil and gas in the North Sea. That's what I would be focusing on right now if I was Prime Minister.
So you're saying that there doesn't seem to be a clear plan from Donald Trump, and obviously blocking the Strait completely is going to lead to presumably higher oil prices as well. So do you think it's a bad idea for America to be doing it?
Well, it's quite clear that there is a problem that needs solving. There is a war between the US and Iran. Obviously, Iran is an enemy of our country. We are on the side of the United States in that, but there needs to be a plan. Iran is already carrying out a blockade of those straits. It's having an impact globally. It will eventually have an impact in Europe and in the United Kingdom. We're already seeing some of that. What is the solution? Something needs to be done. However, I'm not in a position to give operational sort of suggestions on what should be happening. I'm not privy to those details. So I can only talk about what is very clear, and that is that we are causing even more damage by not harnessing our own oil supplies at a time when we can see oil and gas supplies across the world just shrinking.
I mean, you've been pretty scathing about the state of the military. Could we get involved in this blockade even if we wanted to?
Well, this is one of the things that I was talking about on Saturday at the London Defence Conference. I gave a speech where I said, before the war in Ukraine, we were able to send munitions support, whereas with this war, it took 2 weeks to get HMS Dragon out of Portsmouth. What's happened? What's happened to all those plans? Where is the defence investment plan? Where is the money? The Prime Minister keeps talking about how he's increasing defence spending, but it's all words. There has been no action at all since he came in.
But you take responsibility from the previous Conservative administration as well, right? For not spending enough on defence.
Defence spending went down from 1989 to 2022. Actually, when I was in Cabinet, we increased defence spending. And I can't take responsibility for what my predecessors did. They have to do that. I don't have a time machine. What I can do is say what the Conservative Party will do now. Mistakes were made in the past. I'm not going to repeat those mistakes. We need to start spending money on defence. That's why we found money for a sovereign defence fund, putting the two-child benefit cap back in place so we can have more troops. We've got a plan to 3%. Labour don't.
You also want to recruit 6,000 more soldiers. I mean, can you see a situation where you might back some kind of conscription? I mean, we've seen that in other countries.
I don't think we need conscription. What we need to do is make sure that we incentivize people to go into our armed forces. That means better pay, better equipment, and that's what the money from the two-child benefit cap can do. We talked about getting an extra 20,000, 14,000 reservists, 6,000 regulars, but I don't think we need to be talking about conscription. Let's make sure that we actually look after the troops that we've got. We could stop persecuting them. Labour's Troubles Bill, for example, just hounding veterans endlessly. That's the kind of thing that puts people off joining the army.